John Healey, Defence Secretary, thank you so much for joining us on the One Decision podcast. It's been, by some people's accounts, a successful summit. Have you sensed a change in American attitudes towards NATO being here?
Yeah, some people are calling this historic. In the political and public debate, historic's often overused, but I think this could be described as that. We've got the 32 nations of NATO stepping up to respond to the increasing threats we all face, with a commitment to a new benchmark, a new target of 5% spending by 2035, and that's about core defence, but for the first time it's also about the other national security elements that are important and increasingly important to us all, but also commitments to developing the capabilities that strengthen the deterrence and keep us all safe. So this is a good day for NATO. It's a good day for British industry and jobs. It's a bad day for Putin. And in terms of the American attitude, so I was with Defence Secretary Hegseth in February, soon after President Trump issued his challenge to the European nations in NATO in particular, and Pete Hegseth came to NATO headquarters to the meeting I'd convened of the organisations supporting Ukraine. And he was very clear about the challenge to us all to step up. It was a tough challenge, and he made clear at the time Europe stepping up doesn't mean the US stepping away. And what I've seen, I think, and felt, and it's been there in the main meeting, but also in the side meetings, is a sense from the Americans that they're greatly encouraged by the extent that the rest of NATO have stepped up and are willing to do much more in the years ahead. And that's as it should be. For some time, Keir Starmer and I have been arguing that European nations need to do more of the heavy lifting, and that NATO needs to become more European, and it will.
So in a way, I mean, not to be reductive, but would you count this as a win for President Trump? Because that's certainly how Mark Rutte is pitching this. You know, this is something that only Donald Trump, the type of president he is, could have achieved.
I think it's certainly true. This NATO summit, this declaration, this set of commitments would not have happened without President Trump. But none of us have done this for President Trump. We've done this because it's necessary. And it's necessary to respond to the increasing threats that we face, to the rising nuclear risks, and that's one of the reasons that we've made this big announcement with the biggest strengthening of the UK's nuclear posture in a generation.
I want to come on to talk to you about that in just a moment, but you talk about the threat that NATO faces. Many people, including when you speak to some of the Ukrainians who are here, they have been a bit concerned that maybe the issue of Ukraine-Russia has been sidelined, maybe partly because there is a concern about American attitudes towards Ukraine and that particular fight. Have you sensed any warming of relations, any more positivity from the American administration towards Ukraine? Because let's be frank, it has been a bit fraught in the past.
Well, the most, and I speak with the defence minister in Ukraine very regularly. I see President Zelensky on a regular basis, and Keir Starmer and I received and spent the afternoon with President Zelensky in Downing Street at the beginning of this week. And we did that in part because we recognise that most eyes have been on the Middle East in recent weeks, with good reason and understandably. But for Ukraine, it's really important that we don't drop our sight of Ukraine, because that's exactly what Putin wants. And so our talks with President Zelensky at the beginning of the week before this NATO summit, the big commitment that this NATO summit is making to support Ukraine, are all important markers, not just to keep the confidence of the Ukrainians to maintain the courage to fight the Russian invasion, but big signals to Putin as well that we're a large number of nations standing by Ukraine in the fight, willing to stand with Ukraine as well if a negotiated ceasefire can be achieved. But there's much more that we need to do, and we really look to President Trump to help bring Putin to the negotiating table, to negotiate, not to go through the motions and talk, because in the end, a ceasefire is in everyone's best interest.
Are those talks still alive somewhere? We don't really talk much about them anymore. And is it your sense that the more that Donald Trump has seen of that conflict, the more Donald Trump has seen of the reality of President Putin, the more that he recognises actually being foursquare behind Ukraine is the best place to be.
Well, certainly what President Trump, the Defense Secretary and the American delegation will have had over these 2 days of the summit, they would have been part and have been part of discussions in which the argument that Ukraine is the front line of our European security, the argument that Ukraine needs our support in the fight and at the negotiating table, and that the critical leadership role that President Trump can play remains at the centre of the prospects for a negotiated ceasefire. He, after all, has opened up this opportunity, and the discussions and the urging of many people at this summit, including from Prime Minister Starmer and from me with our counterparts and David Lammy, has been that the US can pick up that leadership role, can help bring Putin to the negotiating table, and if we can get a ceasefire in Ukraine, then the UK alongside the French are also ready to lead the coalition of the willing to help make that a lasting ceasefire, a lasting peace where Ukraine can become its own deterrent against any future Russian invasion.
It sounds to me like you're saying that, you know, America gets as much out of being in this alliance as all of the other nations do, and maybe there's been a bit of, well, I don't want to say this, but do you think sometimes America plays this game of making it look like there's one foot out of the door, but actually the reality is America is never going to walk away from NATO? I mean, I'm thinking about Donald Trump's comments on the plane overnight about Article 5. I mean, I presume that you would say you trust America would be there if called upon. Do you think there is sometimes a bit of game playing to make European nations sit up and listen?
I don't think America plays a game with NATO. It's too serious for that. And when Keir Starmer first went to the White House in the Oval Office, President Trump said to him in public, "I'm committed to Article 5." And that
sometimes he says the opposite, though.
Well, look, fundamentally, the commitment to the alliance, the commitment to the principle of the alliance, that attack against one is an attack against all, is our collective defence and deterrence. And Article 5 has only been triggered once, and that was after 9/11, the terrorist attacks on New York, and every one of the NATO allies responded to America's call and to America's aid at that time.
And so the message to America is, we helped you, we would expect you to be there for us, I presume.
No, the message to America is, it doesn't need to be said. They're a member of this alliance. They do a great deal of the heavy lifting. They're fundamental to the strength of the alliance. And what they're saying to us, the rest of us, is the challenge to you is to step up and do more. We've recognised the case for doing that, Keir Starmer and I, for 4 or 5 years. This NATO summit confirms that the rest of NATO is stepping up, and the Americans have always been clear. That doesn't mean them stepping away, but it does mean it will allow them to provide more of the priority focus that they have on the Indo-Pacific. But in the end, the two are linked, and we see this in Ukraine, with Chinese technology helping the Russians, Iranian drones and missiles helping the Russians, and North Korean troops actually fighting on the front line because Putin is struggling to get enough of his own people to the front line, and has passed this month that really grim milestone of 1 million Russian casualties killed or injured in this fight.
John Healey, UK Defence Secretary, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.